faculty, I'm Kevin B. Harrington, Student Ambassador. On behalf of faculty, staff, and students of the New Hampshire Institute of Politics at St. Anselm College, I'd like to welcome you and thank you for joining us at this afternoon's event. The Institute's mission is to educate, engage, and empower citizens of all ages to actively participate in the civic and political life of their communities and strengthen democracy. The Institute is nonpartisan and does not endorse political issues or candidates. Before we begin this afternoon's program, I would just like to remind you to turn off any cell phones or any other devices that might make noise. Today's speaker is Dr. Carmen McClish. Dr. McClish received her Ph.D. in communications from UMass Amherst in 2007. She specializes in the intersection of communication and culture. Her published work focuses on play and politics in public spaces and Caribbean culture. She's an assistant professor in St. Anselm's English department. Today she will give a presentation as part of the Institute's faculty research colloquium series titled Play, Urban Tricksters, Rebel Clowns, and the Unruly Mob. Dr. McClish's discussion will focus on playful antics in public spaces, including clowning and street art. By offering concrete examples of play in public spaces, citizenship and social protest can be understood in new and dynamic ways. Dr. McClish's research focuses on the intersection of communication and culture with specific interest in play and politics in U.S. public spaces and everyday life in carnival culture in the Caribbean. Following Dr. McClish's remarks, we will have a brief question and answer period. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Carmen McClish.
Thanks for being here in April. We're all very busy, so I appreciate you guys being here today. What I'm talking about today is a book project that I began in 2010 when I was in Boston. And I got about half the book done, and in 2011 I was hired at the University of the West Indies in Trinidad, and quickly shelved the book to kind of switch my focus, which I think we all would do, with the opportunity to look at play and everyday life in Trinidad, as well as carnival culture. So today I want to talk a little bit about the book. I'm going to start with talking a little bit about play. What is play? What is meant by play? By discussing it a little bit and then defining it. I'm then going to discuss sort of the structure around play in terms of the theoretical considerations, in terms of the relationship between play and both democratic engagement as well as social protest in public and corporate spaces. And I'm going to give a lot of examples on that. I'm kind of in the process of revisiting the book in the last year, which is interesting. I think the theories still hold up. Some of the examples may need to be changed, and as things, of course, have changed a lot since 2010. Politically, I'm looking forward to seeing what you guys have to say about some of my ideas today. So let's start by talking about what is play. I became interested in play theory when I was a graduate student, probably because play is a very slippery concept itself, and I sort of like to delve into things that are uncomfortable. We all know when we're playing, when we have these moments, maybe we're engaging with friends, we lose track of time, and we're sort of elated. We know what play feels like. But the theorizing of play is a difficult matter. Part of it is because play studies is an interdisciplinary discipline, an interdisciplinary focus and endeavor. While many areas have studied play, no discipline is called its own. So in looking at play theory, I was looking at cultural anthropology, psychology, sociology, folklore, theater. I think I'm missing something. No, that covers about most of it. So it's very interdisciplinary by nature. So how do we understand play, what play means? I want to start with a quote by Huizinga, who's a Dutch historian, famous for his early book on play called Homo Ludens, which was published in 1938. Here he's saying play is a uniquely adaptive act, not subordinate to some other adaptive act, but with a special function all its own in terms of human experience. Early on, Huizinga was really talking about play as actually preceding any ideas we even have of culture, and as being really a very different experience than any other engagement that we have. Victor Turner, a British cultural anthropologist, discusses play as offering more apt or interesting designs for living. Brian Sutton Smith, an American development psychologist and professor, states that the chief function of play is its positive affective quality, a combination of fun and whimsy which distinguishes this activity from all others. And Thomas Hendricks, an American sociology, states that play is the laboratory of the possible. To play fully and imaginatively is to step sideways into another reality between the cracks of ordinary life. One thing you can kind of see in terms of some of these quotes is this idea of play as being this sort of activity that's outside of maybe what we would consider means to an end activities we engage in, or what some people have called non-play. So what would be the opposite of play? Gregory Bateson states that the opposite of play would be an activity marked by a lack of pleasure, an element of constraint, and stark realism. So this idea of play is really this experience that's very different than sort of these activities that we engage in. How is it different? It's often considered to be a break in pace from activities that may precede it or follow it. An example of this is we lose track of time when we're playing. How many of you found you're in a moment where you're with friends and you're engaging in this way and it's this heightened communication situation, all of a sudden you're like, oh no, the time. And this is really sort of these play situations that I'm talking about here. Because it is so interdisciplinary, there's lots of disagreements about what play is. Is play serious or frivolous? Is it productive or unproductive? Is play risky, or do we only play in safe spaces? But most theorists would agree in terms of play that play is based in freedom, that freedom is necessary for play, and this is a link that I make between play and ideas of democratic activity. So I'm defining play as both an activity and an attitude. In terms of an attitude, it's hard to play if you don't come into it with a playful attitude. So these things I think are linked. So I'm defining play as a communication act that is based in ambiguity in both language and bodily gestures, maybe exaggeration, sarcasm in some way. It facilitates individual freedom and growth in social dynamics, and provides a space for critiquing and creating culture. Play is a heightened form of communication. The goal of play is the experience itself, which requires the participant to be centered in the present moment. Specifically within my research, I'm looking at more disorganized play. I'm not looking at sports, I'm not looking at games, and I'm specifically looking at play that's really kind of centered in people being together and engaging with each other in either public or corporate spaces, and that centers the book and this research. So I think that play matters. Part of my interest in this is just generally I would rather play than not play. I'm definitely somebody who, given the opportunity, I would like to engage in these things more and more. So I think that play matters. I think that play is the good stuff our lives are made of. I think these are the moments of individual growth and social experimentation. So this study explores the choices we make and how we want to play together, and how these choices reflect commentary on contemporary issues on both a local and global level. I'm looking at democratic activity generally and social protest more specifically, and I think some of my examples will lend to that. Some of these images here, Abbie Hoffman, certainly considered a clown during his period of time and what he did in terms of social protest. Breaded puppets, still in Vermont, still creating these large-scale puppets in terms of social protest and theater. And the top right photo is from the WTO protest in 1999 in Seattle. Really one of the protests that saw this idea of playfulness really being interacted in this large public protest. So why play in social protest? Researchers found that play considers the best, researchers found that the public considers the best devices for play to be idealism, compassion, courage, fun, and humor. This seems somewhat obvious, I think, if we're thinking about ideas of engagement and wanting more people to engage. But most theory on social movements and social protests looks more at the emotional base of protest being anger. And I think we're all kind of angry right now. I'm definitely my anger in what's going on in this country right now. And I think that it motivates us. But I don't think it's obviously an emotional space we want to be in for a very long period of time. All right? So although it's an initial motivator, where do we go from here? And it's certainly, I think if we're dealing with non-play situations in our lives all the time, we want something to engage in that actually is a relief from the stark realism of life, right? So the part of the issue is the emotional base is really in terms of anger, in terms of how social protest has been looked at. Also, the success of social protest has been measured by policy change. And that's limited because obviously policy change takes a long period of time, and also how successful a social movement is can be regarded in many different ways outside of simply policy change. So this image is kind of hard to see, but this is a aerial photograph of the Women's March. So what you're seeing are the pink hats. So certainly having elements of play, being a larger protest, or what I'm going to talk about today is chaotic play. This is my friend Ben Shepard and Time's Up out of New York City, who I worked with for a long time when I was living in Boston. And they are protesting the demolition of community gardens here. So he is ringing the bell saying the bulldozers are coming, as we ride our bikes through New York City, a more kind of performative type of play. And then this is more like street art. And it's interesting when you think of play as street art. But if you think of how we move through our cities or how we move through our towns, oftentimes we're used to sameness. And once there's something that makes us go, what is that? Or why would someone create this like lovely bird behind this bush, or paint sort of these old kind of, gas station tanks in this way? Why would someone do that? So it's both kind of our engagement with it as well. So I have three theoretical propositions, and I'm going to talk about examples of each. First, chaotic play, or what I call the unruly mob. This is the type of public play that involves a large amount of people. Obviously, this kind of play is not necessarily encouraged by the state or commerce. The idea of the public actually being in public spaces, especially in large groups, brings about fear of the crowd. This image here is of Reclaim the Streets from the 1990s. Coming out of the rape movement, they would literally block off highways and have dance parties, just saying that these are our spaces, and this was their engagement. Performative play, which I'm basing in the clown idea and clowning. Clowns are often the butt of jokes, but historically, clowns are the few that have actually been able to have free speech in terms of their engagement. So if we think of clowns, we're really thinking of this idea of the voice of both political and cultural criticism. So from Daria Fo in his Berlin Political Theater, to Abby Hoffman, to the Circa clowns, who I'll be talking about today, this idea of clowning and embarrassing oneself has always been considered central in terms of social protest. And finally, I'm going to talk about aesthetic play. And aesthetic play hasn't been discussed very much in terms of actually being play per se. The image here is of what kind of a new type of graffiti that you see a lot coming out, which you can see from a previous photo too, this kind of nature graffiti, where people kind of create graffiti around nature, creating something interesting and not necessarily something ugly. So in terms of aesthetic play, I'm kind of basing it around several ideas. I'm basing it on John Dewey's artist experience, and this idea of how we experience art and play as being very central to that, whether we're creating art or if we're just engaging with it in our cities and towns. I'm building this around Guy Debord and the Situationalist International, and their idea that capitalist culture is boring, and therefore we have to create these moments, these fleeting moments of interest. And finally, I'm centering it around the tricksters. So if you're a clown, you're embarrassing yourself in public. If you're a trickster, you're going in, you're kind of turning things on their head, and you're disappearing from the scene. So those people that kind of create this sort of street art or these sort of public space engagements in this way are, rather than embarrassing themselves, are there involved. Dwight Conquergood states that the trickster plays with social order, unsettling certainties. The trickster intensifies awareness of the vulnerability of our institutions. They're creating these sorts of moments and then disappearing. So I'm going to talk about these three different types of play, and I want to give some of the examples from the book in progress as well. So I'm going to start by talking about chaotic play. I'm going to talk about critical mass and International Pillow Fight Day. I'm going to move to talk about performative play. I'm going to talk about the Clandestine Insurgent Rebel Clown Army and the Reverend building the Church of Stop Shopping. I'm then going to talk about aesthetic play, and I'm going to talk about street art generally, and then guerrilla gardening and Detroit demolition. And I'm going to do this in 20 minutes. All right, that's a challenge, or something like that. So we already talked about chaotic play a little bit. Chaotic play is interesting because if you think of public spaces, you think of the fact that they should be public and that we should be able to congregate there. But as soon as a large crowd congregates in any sort of public space, well, it brings about nervousness, this sort of fear of the crowd. I'm basing this section on crowd psychology and ideas that the larger the crowd, the more fear it instills, whether or not there's any reason to feel fearful. Also, if large groups gather in corporate spaces, it has an even more sort of negative connotation in terms of how we understand it. So I'm going to start with critical mass. So critical mass started in San Francisco in 1992. And what this is large-scale public protests in terms of a cleaner urban environment that involve a lot of people on bicycles taking over roadways. They've always been pretty controversial because usually they block traffic entirely. So they're met with frustrations. And curiously, about 10 years after critical mass began, there was critical manners, which was a group that didn't last for very long, but people that were like, oh, we want to play with cars. Or critical mass was like, no. We're gonna stop you in terms of what that looks like. At this point in time, there are over 400 cities in over 5 countries that have annual critical mass rides, still to this day. Some have monthly rides, such as Somerville, Mass. They have a monthly ride, and you can always find it because there's lots of honking around it, if you're wondering when it is. Some of these communities even have them monthly. So it's really about bicycle subculture. So they're all about localism, they're all about a more human pace, they're all about a more healthy environment. So critical mass is an example of what I would term chaotic play. They also have been inspired other groups, including Time's Up that I was talking about out of New York City, where while I was working with them, we were trying to save some of the community gardens in New York City, which I'll talk about a little bit later when I talk about Guerrilla Gardening. And we did 2 different rides while I was there. One, we were dressed up as fruits and vegetables and flower gardens and riding around New York City with Journey's Don't Stop Believing, blasting out on one of the bikes at the end. And we were met by New Yorkers clapping in their enthusiasm, but also we were taking up a path. We were not necessarily blocking all of the traffic in terms of that. But it, with my friend with her paper mache broccoli head, and my friend Ben with his giant tomato, it was super fun and interesting. Very kind of different ride than when we did the bulldozers are coming, which you saw the image of, where paper mache horse heads were created for bikes, and we actually drove to areas that were outside of sort of the normal area. So we were dropping off fruits and flowers at Giuliani's, and we were met by blue white shirts, as they would call them, and then as we transferred different districts, another set of cops. And we went from about 100 people to only about 30 of us hanging in at the end, feeling very uncomfortable, as the cops planked us the whole way. Different, right? But certainly inspired all these movements that still are engaged with taking over these public spaces in real ways. Another example is International Pillow Fight Day. International Pillow Fight Day comes out of the flash mobs of the 1990s, although it's kind of has a different feel to it. The first International Pillow Fight Day was in March of 2008. Yes. And then after that, they switched it to April 1st. So it's April 1st of every year. It's an interesting thing. I wrote an article about International Pillow Fight Day because I was like, why is it so compelling that the entire world would want to engage with beating each other with pillows and once a year? And it's interesting because it has many different motivations in terms of why people would engage. Some people are like, I want to take back my public spaces. Some people are like, I want to blow off steam. I want to connect with people. It continues on, which is interesting. This year, on April 1st, there were over 23 countries that participated, including, just for a few, India, Mexico, Poland, Romania, Czech Republic, and Hong Kong. So it's all around the world. This is a photo I took of International Pillow Fight Day in Boston in 2009. Interestingly, it kind of varies in terms of engagement. So Boston will always have their pillow fights in parks. So even though there's law enforcement there, it tends to be a fairly mellow occasion. New York City usually likes to start theirs at Wall Street and then watch them as they get arrested and chased out. It's a different space, right? So how people react to it will really vary. Okay, performative play. Again, we talked a little bit about this in terms of the clown and clowning, the long history of performance and play. The Clandestine Insurgent Rebel Clown Army come out of the UK. They've been around since 2003. They're a very popular group in the UK, in Brazil. Not as popular in the US. We have a group in San Francisco and one in New York City. Mostly because it's sort of general the thought that law enforcement at public protests in the U.S. tends to be tends to have less of a sense of humor, I should say, than officers in the UK in terms of protest. They are an anti-war, anti-corporate globalization group that does both public protest, but also will protest in front of Army recruitment centers and other places as well. I have a friend who's in San Francisco who's a circa clown. What's interesting is you have to be trained to be an official circa clown, which involves first understanding nonviolent tactics. So knowing what to do if you're grabbed by a police officer, for instance, and also clowning. So it's a combination of knowing both of these things to actually be a clown. A friend of mine in San Francisco recalled to me that the true challenge is to stay a clown even when conventional power relations assert themselves. So these clowns will try to play with police in different ways. They'll kiss their shoes, they'll give them flowers, they'll compliment how they're dressed, they'll try to engage in this way. They also will show up at protests with being very big clowns, with very full pockets, and they have to empty their pockets, and they empty toys and food and all sorts of crazy things in their pockets, and they're basically clowns. When you're at social protests, often they will move you from pen to pen, and they'll act like they're playpens and jump in and out of them. So they engage in this way. But he was recalling this specific story when police officers charged a group of clowns, and they scattered like clowns in different directions. While they were running by bystanders, they stated, "We must be very dangerous." So kind of playing with these ideas of how we can engage in these larger scale protests, performing, but also in terms of these smaller types of clowning events as well. The Reverend Billy and the Church of Stop Shopping. The Reverend Billy is Bill Talent, and he is a reverend, and it's not sarcastic. Really what he's doing is he's talking about materialism as really being the doom of all of us in this culture. That's kind of what centers his argument. He started protesting in Times Square in 1998 as a solo performer against Disney's environmental and human rights issues. So he was protesting in front of the Disney store. He is now flanked by 40 choir members and their Don't Buy It band, and travels throughout the U.S. in terms of that. Slightly different scenario than circa clowns, because really he centers as the clown, and for the most part is arrested often while his choir and his band is not. So aside from Disney, he also targets Walmart and other stores that or big box stores, specifically sweatshop labor, union busting, and any ideas he considers to be fake bohemia. So Starbucks, he has a reputation for going into Starbucks and telling people to, this is fake, this isn't real, go to a real coffee shop, follow me and my choir, and they will, or not, in terms of engaging in this way. He's published several books, including 2003, What Should I Do If the Reverend Billy Is in My Store? And in 2007, Morgan Spurlock produced a documentary about him in the Church of Stop Shopping called What Would Jesus Buy? And specifically following him through Disneyland, as him and his choir invaded Disneyland. And we're telling people, this is fake, come out to the real world, and of course was arrested. But has really made an impact in terms of ideas of anti-consumerism, including probably being partially responsible for Starbucks finally giving free trade coffee after being in there for many, many times protesting what they were doing. Okay, and then finally, aesthetic play. So aesthetic play, again, is I'm basing in ideas of John Dewey's artist experience and Guy Debord's ideas from the Situationalist International. He states that this combination of capitalism creates a culture that is boring, therefore wrong, arguing that the ideology of the Western world is all the same, based in passive speculative consumption, that our everyday lives are unfulfilling, and as citizens we are uninspired and alienated. He argues that fleeting situations, which are often appointed with play and art, would reveal what otherwise would remain hidden. In this moment, citizens would experience freedom. So again, I'm basing this idea of aesthetic play in Dewey, Debord, as well as the Trickster. When we think of street art, we often think of graffiti, and often it's appointed with graffiti. And I'm interested in graffiti, but more so graffiti that turns ugly places into beautiful places versus tagging or other kinds of graffiti. art has really kind of changed in the last couple of decades. So this kind of incorporation of graffiti nature, which you see in this image here, as well as the white and black image there with the tree kind of running through it. There's also this new thing called moss art, which somehow you can spray moss, which is a new thing to me, on the sides of buildings. So this says nourish. There's also in the last decade or so, this what's called either knit feedy or yarn bombing, which is creating sweaters, I guess, for bicycle racks or light poles. So this idea of crocheting these things, which is met with more enthusiasm than necessarily traditional graffiti because it's more temporary. It also is really interesting because if we think of crocheting and knitting, we think of kind of a female private activity that now is like a public piece of art. So it's interesting in terms of that. Finally, this little image at the right bottom, this is Mark Jenkins out of Washington, D.C. He does cave sculptures in public spaces, which are also temporary. Here he has turned a parking meter into a lollipop, and this gentleman's trying to figure out what to do. Oftentimes, people will take his art home, or sometimes you can just certainly throw them away, but the temporary nature of it is interesting, and given the fact that it's easy to make, there's been lots of copycats groups around the U.S. that are creating this type of art. Okay. Guerrilla gardening. I don't think of gardening as being this sort of street art, but it really is in terms of how people engage. It began in 1973 in New York City, specifically because of the housing boom and the fact that there were lots of empty lots just left. So people in communities in New York City decided, you know, this is attracting bad elements or it's attracting trash, and our kids are going out to play, we've got to do something about it. So they started gardening on these lots. And it's interesting because it really varies in terms of people's motivations of why they do it. Usually the land is private property, so they do not own it, and this is part of the interesting what Time's Up is trying to do in terms of keeping these gardens in New York City. Actually, these people that have been sort of tending these gardens sometimes since the 1970s don't actually own the property. What you'll find in New York City is literally gardens that would be from this front row over here, tiny little gardens in neighborhoods, and gardens that are as large as this building with chickens running around and other things. Sometimes flower, sometimes vegetable gardens, fruit trees. It's an interesting thing because we think of New York City, we think, thank goodness they have Central Park, right? Otherwise, how would you live in New York City? But also there's so many, there's hundreds of these small community gardens all over New York City. In terms of how they engage, sometimes it will be at night, so they can kind of hide it. Sometimes it'll be during the day in terms of how they engage with it. But certainly, it is not necessarily a legal activity. And why would gardening be anything in terms of street art? Well, if you think about how we engage, it's always nice to be surprised by something. And being surprised by plants is no different than being surprised by you know, a parking meter wearing a sweater. Things that surprise us are good. Why are they good? Because they slow us down. Because we look at the neighborhood in a new way. Maybe we feel inspired. They engage us in different ways, and that's key in terms of how we understand our cities and our towns. It's funny because I lived in Concord for a couple of years, and there was always a street where somebody had put an old bike with a flower pot in it, and I always drive by and think, it's the bike with the flower pot. It's obviously not in front of necessarily someone's house that owns it, right? So this engagement can be really interesting and important. And finally, Detroit Demolition, which since I worked on the book now calls themselves Object Orange. Obviously, this is a group out of Detroit. I'm assuming most of us know a little bit about what happened with Detroit. Basically, middle class flight that took place now has left abandoned buildings kind of strewn all over Detroit. And in 2006, this group of 7 people decided, well, you know, these are so ugly, you know, and they're always marked with like an orange D for demolition, even though they sit there year after year after year. So they're like, let's go out in the middle of the night and paint these houses bright orange. Create sort of an odd and sort of strange, kind of almost eerie effect on the sort of landscape of Detroit with all of these falling down houses. Is it art? Not necessarily, but it kind of creates something that's interesting. Also another group that has been, other copycat groups have come out of Detroit Demolition, including in St. Louis. They've started doing this in some neighborhoods as well. They were super surprised to find out what happened. After they painted 11 houses, 4 of them quickly were torn down. They were like, oh, okay, well this is great. This is not what we were expecting. We were just trying to create something kind of fun and interesting out of something that was ugly. So it had this interesting effect that they in no way thought would actually happen. So I believe that, despite the sort of time spent away from these ideas still hold true in terms of our engagement. That if we can engage in social protest and it's more playful, probably do it for longer, probably engage in it in more ways than we would necessarily if it was based in ideas of anger. So it provides moments of fleeting fun, it creates new visual culture, possibly community beautification, and I think remains an important part of how we kind of conceive of how as citizens we want to engage in our public and public spaces. Thank you. I'd happy to take questions or comments. Yes.
One of your slides sort of noted this briefly, but the whole time you were talking, I was thinking about the fact that play is always over. Whether it's a protest, whether it's a spontaneous clowning, or even that nature, those nature paintings, they're going to change.
Yeah.
It's going to die or something like that, or get cut back. And then, of course, most of all, being a child is over.
Yeah.
We grow away from that. And so I wonder if you could talk about this specialness to play, because it doesn't last, or it's ephemeral, it's temporary. It might flash up in another way, another time, but it's temporary.
It is temporary, and I think that most of the people that kind of create this art also would assume it's temporary. And also, it's often co-opted as well. So even like flash mobs became co-opted very quickly, and corporations were having their flash mob for Mitsubishi or whatever. And it kind of killed it, then it came back in a different way. So I think that that's true. I think what's interesting about play as children is it teaching us how to adapt and learn. And play as adults, it just becomes sort of necessary in terms of being able to find joy in it all. Csikszentmihalyi, who is a Hungarian psychologist, talks a lot about ideas of flow. And flow is really based in play. So these moments of flow are these moments where we feel this sort of opportunity to be engaged, and moments that we can remember fondly. And we'll go back to, remember that time when we did this, and we engaged. So, he did a long-term study where he was looking at more at flow versus boredom than necessarily play, but what he found was even when people were trying only to engage in means to an inactivity, no play, and then writing about their responses, they found that they were more unhappy, less motivated, less focused, and less, able to actually clearly understand what they were doing at any given point. So I think it's all, psychologists would say it's actually necessary in terms of our engagement. But it's, it is temporary. It is temporary. We all have to go back to work. I feel like this is a little bit of play, and after this I got a break. I could find playful, but I'm not at the moment yet.
Just want to challenge your assumption, and I'm sure it's something you've dealt with and are going to have to deal with in the early part of your project. Which, having fun and doing things playfully in order to protest is one thing, but once I have a purpose, I don't feel like I'm playing anymore. I mean, isn't pure play purpose? Isn't purposelessness part of what makes it play? Once I have an end game where I want to move my audience to social consciousness, I can either fail or not. I can either fail or succeed in that. It's no longer play. Whereas I can't fail at play, right?
Well, I think I think you possibly could fail.
Yeah, actually, I failed at play a lot as a kid.
I was just thinking of all the times I failed at play.
But I guess I'm just questioning the intersection of purposefulness and play. Isn't pure play has, as you say, we lose track of time, and I think we also lose track of any particular outcome.
Yeah, and I think that that's true. So certainly you could be planning a playful activity, which feels more like work, right?
Right.
People involved in it. But I think that if the activity is framed around playfulness, you have more of the opportunity to have that than if it's framed around anger.
Yeah.
So I think it's a slippery concept, to say the least, especially in the idea of whether it's productive or unproductive. And the theorists are all over the place in terms of that. So, engaging in it can lend itself to play, but doesn't always. So, for instance, I spent 3 years in Trinidad. Trinidad's all play and no work, including playing at work. So actually getting someone's attention to like get you a cup of coffee was hilarious because they would be playing because their culture's so based in that. So it was like, where's the mainstream? Am I answering your question? I think it's a good consideration. I think it's so slippery. It's just because obviously, like the Women's March, for instance, which I showed an image of earlier on, which is not something I wrote about in my book. I'm just kind of looking at new images. Certainly the motivation of that has to be anger to a certain degree. And certainly some of the women that were there probably did not find play in terms of that. But there are also women in costumes that kind of created different things in terms of movements.
It's a distinction I think several of us have wrestled with in teaching Joseph Pinker and conversatio. Pure leisure is just not something, certainly our students haven't thought about it, and many of us haven't really thought of it in its pure sense because we're no longer thinking about an outcome. And it's a very rare part of our lives where pure leisure isn't trying to accomplish anything. And I kind of think we play in that category.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. I spent a year doing an ethnography in Trinidad where they lime in Trinidad, which is how playing in Trinidad every day is liming. And they're all having fun and like drinking and dancing and carrying on. And I'm like, oh my gosh, when will it end? It's like 4 a.m. I'm too old for this. Why did I sign on to do an ethnography of liming in Trinidad when it's so exhausting? So there was very little like playfulness I found. I was more observing their play versus actually playing. So, yeah.
Could the clowning be an example of non-deliberate or deliberate play? When I think of is there a way to be deliberately playful as a frame, it seemed like the one that stood out to me was the clown example you gave, right? So the clown doesn't know exactly what the clown's going to do. There's a point to be clowning with, certainly there's something deliberate about that, but the clown sort of builds spontaneity into his relationship or his or her relationship with the police officers. And he gave us this. Could you tell that? Could that be, like, how would that play out and how would that spontaneity kind of, it seemed to me there was an implication that challenged power.
Yeah, and I think that that's part of it, especially with circus clowns and their engagement. Yeah, I certainly think that that's true. And part of it also is that specifically they've been around for a little while, since 2003, so now they have relationships even with the police officers in the UK. So there's lots of photos of them walking arm in arm, like wearing their hats and engaging with them in interesting ways. And I'm thinking like, this is so curious in terms of how in many ways they're protesters. And we understand law enforcement and protesters as always being very separate in terms of how they engage. And it's interesting that they've even actually formed those relationships, been able to kind of engage in that sort of playful way. Well, and also, I found, when I was working with Time's Up and all of a sudden I have like a flower arrangement on my head and leaves painted all over my face and wearing this sort of ridiculous costume kind of changed my perspective as well. So there is something I think, and I thought of that today. I was like, if I was in Boise, Idaho, I'd have so many costumes with me. I would just bring them and make you all wear them, and I would like lighten my mood in presenting, because there's something that changes with that kind of engagement. And we can see it with themes and other things. Yes.
I think too, with the clowning, in the sense of, I'm thinking of the court jester, right?
Yeah.
The court jester in a way was saying things about the king and his presence, or the queen, or whatnot, is that they're not perceived as a threat. So perhaps it's something about like, the kind of outfit being seen as not a threat, and opening up other ways of engaging, even if they are what they're doing is protesting.
Well, and even, the example of running away from policemen. And as clowns, there's something that's ridiculous about seeing police officers chase after clowns. There's no way to look at that and not think that there's something funny about that. So playing off of that's really interesting in terms of that sort of engagement. Like there has to be that.
Also, I was thinking of the commercial just came out yesterday, Kendall Jenner Kendall Jenner, the commercial for Pepsi, and she enters this protest and goes up to one of the cops and gives them a Pepsi. It's like, live your life, right? This idea of, can you talk a little more about like co-opting play as a, maybe particularly within kind of non-public spaces like Disneyland or shopping malls or things like that?
Well, you see it especially in terms of flash mobs, but also there's been a lot of cool hunters around since the 1990s, which basically they find something that's different in culture, including teenagers that are in subcultures, and sort of take it and then corporate, push it into more of a corporate product and then kind of kill it. And that happens a lot. I think that even for people that do graffiti, the idea of even doing graffiti at this point in time is like, oh, it's been done, and we have Banksy that's done it really well. Let's do something different. Like, how can we engage in public spaces that are different? There's a guy in New York City that uses trash bags to create animals over the vents from, where you have the subway underneath. And when the vents blow, they become like giant dinosaurs and dogs and other things made out of trash bags. So, and of course, all of these things kind of, are playful in terms of engagement. But they can certainly be co-opted as well. Yes.
So I don't know if they exist anymore, but there used to be an organization called Clowns Without Borders. And when I was in Boston during the war in 1995, a white Land Cruiser drove up to a street corner, and I thought, oh, it's another humanitarian agency, and a bunch of clowns jumped out of the car, and all the kids in the neighborhood come running because their main goal was just to get the kids to play in the middle of a war zone. So
that's great. No, I've never heard of that. That's really interesting. Yeah, it's interesting how this kind of creates sort of spaces. The curious thing about, for instance, International Pillow Fight Day is that these are large events, sometimes with 1,000 to 5,000 people. And the one I went to in Boston had probably around 3,000 people. And there were children there, and teenagers, and college students, and families. But I would witness on several occasions, like somebody having like a child on their shoulder and trying to get into the middle of the crowd, and the crowd would be like, back up a little bit, not hit as hard, and this sort of practice of civility, which is really curious about an event that's been going on for so long, that there's never been a case where, some crazy person shows up with a pillowcase full of rocks or something horrible. That's all I'm sorry, guys. All I can think of it right now. Nothing's ever happened, because of course if it happened, that would be the end of it. So it's interesting because I think some of these things also kind of create ideas of engagement with the public as well, and possibilities of civility, and possibilities of thinking about how we engage with each other in different ways. Yes?
Yeah, this is also churning in my head now, and I want to come back to childhood too, and things you're saying about protests, and maybe push back on Gary's point that, well, Gary actually made the distinction of pure play, and I would agree, pure play maybe doesn't have purpose, but it seems to me that this common denominator is some sort of essential humanness in play, and again, the child, that essential human, and I wonder whether, the purpose, where maybe purpose is okay, right? Protest, or I'm thinking of hippies putting flowers in tanks.
Yes.
And even teaching, right? Is that when we play, maybe we're reminding the non-players or showing the observers what we really are. What a person really is, what a child is, what we are as humans. And it makes you stop and think about that protest, or it makes you, there's an incongruency to it, right? And that's, first of all, alarming, and you notice it, but then you think, oh, we're playing. This is a clown that's protesting, or this is people with beads on their heads, or a flower in a tank. There's something wrong with it, it draws my attention, but then it's, wow, this is who we are. We notice beauty, we enjoy laughing, and we all play. So I wonder if that, maybe that's the purpose. Maybe that's where purpose can have an effect.
Well, certainly, the fact that so many people gather together on April 1st with total strangers in a public space just to have a pillow fight shows that we lack play to a certain degree, not just in the U.S., where I don't think we're encouraged to play. We're pretty much encouraged to work anyway, especially as adults. So the idea that you would play too much as an adult means that you are not very focused or not very mature. So we're really discouraged from these activities anyway. And if we are encouraged, they're very structured activities. So playing sports, that's okay in terms of play, or maybe chess, that's okay in terms of play. But this more kind of childish engagement, such as clowning or playing in these ways, not necessarily as encouraged. And I do think that part of what I think the attractiveness of this type of social protest or democratic activity is that it's like, oh, well, I need this anyway, because I don't have it. I'm doing this, and I feel like I'm actually accomplishing something, or I'm engaging in this way.
Can play fail? Like, is that demolition, like when they painted it orange and then they knocked down a place? Like, is that an example of play failing? Have you been at these protests or read about them where the play doesn't work?
Yeah, and probably one of the examples, and which kind of switched up how play looks, is there were groups that Billionaires for Bush. Does anyone heard of this group when Bush was running? They would appear at social protests as millionaires, so it's very sarcastic, you know. So Billionaires for Bush, like sort of sarcastic approach, and it was considered that way, like more clever than now, and it didn't go over very well. And it was interesting because that period of time there was a lot of sarcasm in terms of protests, and they felt that it was kind of preaching to the choir. It wasn't bringing in new people because they were like, oh, okay, either I don't get it or I get it, and I'm like, okay, you're just being sarcastic. So I think after that, it kind of switched the movement in terms of some of these social protests in some ways, because I actually know people that were involved in that are now super clowns. So I think part of the engagement is being able to switch it up when it doesn't work anymore, or realize, okay, you know, maybe this kind of play is more antagonistic than joyful. Thank you guys so much for coming out today. I really appreciate it. Thank you.